I really enjoyed my time getting to know people here last year at the Integrate Summit. And I got to know the national organization that you all are a part of about 4 years ago, I want to say, for the Saliden Institute. And, a colleague of mine who I've really enjoyed getting to know over the last several years, some of you may know his name, Ken Pargament, who has really influenced the field of spiritually integrated counseling and psychotherapy. He's really been a trailblazer for people like me. And so it's been a real honor to get to work with him over the last 4 years on this project, the John Templeton Foundation project on spiritual competence in mental health care. And he has this phrase, and he says, and I think this is true of this group, the people who work in spiritually integrated care are the best people, just bar none, the best people. And that's true in academia, and I'm an academic. That's my primary vocation. I have some other hats that I wear. I direct my parish's counseling center. But it's been my experience that the people who are really invested in mental health and spirituality just have a unique feel to them. And it's a very hospitable, welcoming presence that isn't always the case in every aspect of mental health. And for those of us who have been in inpatient settings or community mental health settings that are not a part of a spiritually integrated framework, I think you know that. You experience that firsthand. So I'm a little biased, obviously. I think we have the best people. Everybody's the best person, but as Ken Pargament says, our people are just better, I think that's true. So, you pointed out the title of the talk today, Sacred Secularity. I picked up that phrase actually from a talk that the Dalai Lama did several years ago. And I think his phrase was secular spirituality. And his response, actually, when he used that phrase, was, what's going to be the most influential form of spirituality in the years to come? And he said it's a sacred spirituality, a secular spirituality. And I chose that title today because I often work in two worlds. I often work in both the sacred and the secular, and because of who I am, I do that simultaneously. And that can be a little bit of a juggling act at times, to translate the world's wisdom traditions into what I would call the paradigms of scientific study, which pervade our culture and our universities in particular. My background is in a social science field, but I was also trained in a seminary. And so I received my counseling training at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago. And for those of you who know your history, you'll see this pop up later. That was one of our first integrationist institutions in the United States. That program was founded by Gary Collins, who wrote a huge volume called Christian Counseling. We used to call it the Big Yellow Book. Okay, and some may still have that book on your shelves. I have an old copy as well. And so, but from there, I went and got my doctorate at the University of Central Florida, and I was very fortunate to work with and be mentored by multiple presidents of the Association for Spiritual, Ethical, and Religious Values in Counseling. And that is a subdivision of the American Counseling Association that is devoted to the questions of what are the implications for spirituality for mental well-being and its implications, therefore, for mental health care. So that's a little bit about who I am, but I also want to point to this website. This is the John Templeton Foundation funded project, the Spiritual Religious Competencies Project. You can access it through a QR code that you see there you can scan. The website's really easy though. It's www.srcproject.org. And for the last 3 years, We have been researching, training mental health professionals, and studying the effects of that training on their development of spiritual competence in mental health care. And we're really interested in sharing the tools and resources that we've been developing with scholar practitioners for the past 3 years. And all of these are open source. So they're free and open for people anywhere to be able to pick up and utilize in your own practice, or if you're a supervisor or educator with your students that you're working with as training methods. So I will talk a little bit more about that this afternoon. But where I want to start is with an opening meditation that does come from Ken Pargament. And this comes from his Sacred Moments meditation project that he's worked with his student, who's now practicing psychologist Serena Wong. And so I invite you to center yourself for a moment, and I would ask you to just take a few intentional breaths, and we'll do that together. And as you settle into your chair, you can rest your hands comfortably on your lap or keep your feet touching the floor. And close your eyes if you feel comfortable in doing so. Otherwise, settle your gaze on a space that's close to you. Allow your attention to begin to turn inward. You can always return to your breath when you feel lost or when your mind wanders. And let your breath be your anchor. In, out. And remember, there's no right or wrong way of doing this exercise. Just simply breathe. Now, picture a treasure chest in your mind. See if you can envision this sealed chest that contains your most precious memories. Consider the size. How big is it? How heavy? Perhaps your chest is made of wood, of wicker, or lined with fabric. Notice its colors and its finish. Now imagine opening your treasure chest. Maybe it creaks as it opens. And inside the box are your memories. Here are your life's treasured moments, collected in one place as snapshots or moving pictures. You begin moving your chest of memories. As you move through your memories, see if you can find one sacred moment. Maybe you experience it in an encounter with another person. Maybe outdoors. Maybe in response to a piece of music. Or maybe in something seemingly ordinary. In any case, it's a moment in time that feels set apart from others. When you connected with something greater than yourself. Perhaps it's a moment that lifted you up, a moment that feels timeless, a moment that opened your heart to something really real, a moment of deep connection. perhaps as you hold this moment, the edges of it glow. Imagine the essence of this moment wash over you and into you, warmly enveloping you in this sacred memory, drawing you into your sacred moment. And perhaps you are wholly absorbed into this scene. Notice what's ahead of you, behind you, around you in the moment. Recall the sounds of this moment, the temperature, any tastes, smells, or movements that you made. Breathe in this sacred moment and draw what you need from it. Whether it be comfort, gratefulness, or love from this moment. Take in all that you need. Continue to be in this sacred space for the next couple minutes. Now that you've been filled by this moment, allow yourself to let go of it until next time. It'll always be there for you. You can return to your treasure chest at any time. Now gently turn your attention outward into the room, into the present, and all through your body. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes. Anybody experience a sacred moment? Yeah. Well, when I do this exercise, this is a sacred moment that often comes to mind. This is where I used to live, actually. So you asked if there are some pastor's kids in the room? Pastor's kid. I have the dual distinction, though, of being also a missionary kid. So my earliest memories are living in Mexico. This is about 30 minutes from the United States-Mexico border in southern Arizona. The picture on the left are my two oldest sons looking into the backyard of the church parish that my dad was a pastor of. Do you see any people other than my kids? No. That's because this is ranch country where you don't see a living person for potentially hundreds of miles. And so this image comes to mind because this is the beginning, I would say, of my spiritual awakening. These were the sacred moments of when I looked out into that golden field of grass and saw the mountains on the horizon and felt something calling, like you were saying, Bill, earlier this morning. That call, I didn't quite have words for it, but later I would learn this is contemplation. And so that's the field where I have that first kind of moment of sacredness that I experience. And of course, in the church next door, I experienced that same sacredness in my dad's sermons, in the music, right? The picture on the right is when we came back home to visit for my grandfather's funeral. And so this is a canyon that is nearby where I used to live, and I wanted to take my family there so that they could see it. And it's, again, one of those kind of sacred spaces. At that funeral, what we realized was my second son looked identical to my grandfather in his baby pictures. And there was this moment of seeing this deep connection intergenerationally between my grandfather, who I had known, and my second son in particular, who was just coming into being. And that was a moment for me of seeing, wow, there's a deeper connection than even I realized here. And if you're familiar with the Christian liturgy in the burial requiem, there's a phrase in the liturgy that goes, life has not ended. It has taken a different form. And it really came through to me when I went back and spent time grieving the loss of my grandfather. This is one of my favorite pictures of him. this captures the essence of his personality. He was such a trickster, like he was always up to no good. And so he was always agitating and teasing, and I just love that picture because it just, that part of his personality comes through. He's wrestling the rhino as I'm writing it. These are my 4 sons. I now have four kids. I only had 2 back then. And I put this picture up here, not only because they're cute, especially that little baby there, you just want to pinch his little cheeks, but because I was present for all 4 of them when they were born. And 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to be with my grandmother when she died. And so I was able to be with her when she took her final breaths. And again, that sense of interconnection happened for me in that sacred moment of being with her and almost being like a midwife, And if you've ever been with someone who is dying, I think you know what I'm talking about. That there's this moment, I think, of when you feel like you are a witness to something sacred and holy, moving into, again, the next form of life, right? And when I was with my kids, I felt that same sense of sacredness and that same sense of witness of something happening here across the entire spectrum of life. So those are my some of my sacred moments, right? But what I think is so cool about the time that we live in now is that we're having these conversations and we're doing them more in the mainstream and more in the secular environments that we live in. And my favorite way to talk about this, particularly with my students who are learning about spiritually integrated counseling, is to begin with spiritual phenomenology. So if you take a moment and you think about what comes to mind when you hear the phrase, a holy experience. Could be an experience you have had, or it could be one you know about someone else having. What adjectives come to mind, and why do they help illuminate the essence of that holy experience? I ask my students this every year, and I'm always amazed at how consistent the phrases they use to describe holy experiences are. Words like it's ineffable, it's unexplainable, it takes me by surprise, it goes beyond my sense of self, it's ecstatic. I feel a sense of unity, I feel a sense of connection. I feel a sense of awe and inspiring trembling. The consistency of adjectives that come up when people talk about holy experiences, even if they have never had one, but they know someone who has had one, and can describe that from the outside perspective, is amazingly consistent. And I say it's amazingly consistent because when you go to places like the Grand Canyon, has anybody ever been to the Grand Canyon before? Okay. Or if you've never been to the Grand Canyon, have you been to a place in nature that takes your breath away? That you feel awe when you go out and you look out at a horizon of the ocean and it seems to move on toward infinity. Those basic experiences human beings have had since recorded time. And so the native peoples in Arizona to this day consider the Grand Canyon a sacred space, right? So places like this do this frequently for people. This is not abnormal. This has been going on for thousands of years, and many, many people across the globe, actually most people across the globe, report having that experience, okay? I say it's amazingly consistent because this is nothing new. I was a philosophy major before I was a psychology major, and the very first class that I took in philosophy was the philosophy of religious experience. And to this day, it probably was the most influential course I've ever taken. I say that because the book that you see here, The Idea of the Holy, by Rudolf Otto, This is an over 100-year-old text. And Rudolf Otto discovered those same set of adjectives that people describe spiritual experiences. And he found them studying sacred texts across the world. And he coined this phrase, the numinous, the mysterium tremendum. And what he meant by that is that that experience of holiness, the sacred, has these qualities to it that seem to kind of be at odds at each other, but simultaneously fit together into a whole. And it's the fear and the fascination that these experiences bring up for us. It's not a fear like the DSM talks about anxiety. It's a sense of, whoa, it's the awe. That's the fear that Rudolf Otto was talking about. And so it's this grandeur, this sense of something greater than myself is here that's overwhelmingly great. And yet I am fascinated by it. I am attracted by it. And I want to remain at the Grand Canyon as long as I can and just take it all in, okay? William James also did this. And he was one of the first people to scientifically study religious experience. And he did this by interviewing people and studying the interviews that he did with them. And what he stumbled upon was that there are kind of 4 basic adjectives or words that people use to describe experiences of a spiritual nature that he called mystical. One, he said, you can't describe them. You know, so that image you had earlier about what spiritually integrated counseling is, I saw one word on there and it was unexplainable, right? Ineffable. You can't put language to it. It goes beyond language. It has a noetic quality. So what it means is that it gives us something that we understand. You know, there's a truth that we take in with these experiences. And they don't have to necessarily be explained. We just simply know them. We know that's true. They're transient. They come and go. You know, no one is always at Mount Sinai. You know, people come back down from the mountain, right? They're transient, they come and go. No one stays in that place inevitably. And then thirdly, they're passive. These are experiences, they come and go, but it's not something that you conjured up or created. It's something that feels like it's happening, but it's not something you feel like you controlled from the beginning. So over 100 years, these 4 basic qualities have been reaffirmed through social science. And there's actually a scientific measure called Hood's mysticism scale that is easily accessible. It's free to use. And you can go through there and see, you know, have I had this type of an experience before? And those 4 factors have held up over 100 years since they were first recorded. Anybody familiar with the Transcendentals? Or has anybody ever been to the Sistine Chapel? The Sistine Chapel, for me, you know, I was kind of not expecting much. I felt like I had already seen it. You know, I'd seen so many images of it. I was shocked by the feeling of transcendence I had when I walked in and looked up at the ceiling the first time. And I thought, oh, that's what everybody's talking about. That feeling of, oh, there's truth, there's beauty in here, there's goodness in here. These are called the Transcendentals. And they're unitary. You don't necessarily have to break them up into separate pieces. They all come together simultaneously. So if you find truth, you find goodness. And if you find goodness, you also find beauty. They're all one essence of the same spiritual experience. And again, these have been happening for people for decades. We also have been looking at this from the lens of religious studies, right? So a lot of the social science work started to borrow from religious studies frameworks. And so one framework that has been really explored a lot is Ninian Smart's The Dimensions of the Sacred. And if you look at sacredness, Ninian Smart has kind of identified there's 6 basic areas that you can start to understand this from. You can understand it, which we've been doing from the experiential dimension. People have experiences like this. But the world's religions, what they're really good at is now putting those into frameworks that we can now understand. And so explaining, what a religious experience is can be really helpful to do in a religion precisely because it brings together so many dimensions of what seems confusing and seems unexplainable and puts a framework around that we can understand through the mythology, through the doctrines, through the ethical systems. And so all of these are now being studied scientifically. What do they do for people when you have different types of religious beliefs? We can't get too far down the road in this conversation, though, without talking about these figures who are looming in the background of every time we talk about spirituality. So what I've been talking about is kind of the core essence of spiritual experience. But these folks, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, had a very suspicious view of what I just described. On the surface, yes, that looks like the mysterium tremendum, the numinous, the infinite, etc. But really what's going on there are these kind of basic psychological drives that are then being projected out there onto, for Freud, because everything for Freud at that time was a father figure of God, being projected onto a father figure called God, who will rescue us from everything, provide us care and sustenance, etc. So in other words, religious experience is not what it seems. And that is actually what became mainstream mental health care's perspective of spirituality. There are a few kind of noteworthy examples. There's several you could pull from, but one that I find really, really helpful is looking at Albert Ellis's perspective. So Albert Ellis, who I'm sure many people in here know, was the founder of rational emotive behavioral therapy, right? Well, he wrote a book called A Case Against Religion, a psychotherapist's view and the case against religiosity. And Albert Ellis's basic perspective was that there are certain things that all practicing psychological professionals agree are helpful for people to have a healthy psychological well-being, okay? And they're listed there in front of you. Need to have healthy self-interest, self-direction, tolerance, acceptability of uncertainty, flexibility, scientific thinking, commitment, and risk-taking. All of these factors are things that are psychologically beneficial, okay? It was Albert Ellis's belief that religion sabotaged all of these. So let's just take the first example. Instead of having a healthy self-interest, religious people are too preoccupied about what God thinks about them, almost obsessively. And in his case, he would probably say, yes, obsessively, right? That's just one example. This quote kind of summarizes it, though. He says, all true believers in any kind of orthodoxy, whether it be religious, political, social, or even artistic orthodoxy, are distinctly disturbed since they are obviously rigid, fanatic, and dependent individuals. For that, again, is what all manner of religion essentially is: childish dependency. Okay, pretty strong words, right? Now, let's give Albert Ellis some credit. Late in his life, before he passed away, he did acknowledge that if people have a loving God image, that can be psychologically healthy, okay? But this was mainstream mental health perspective on what spirituality is and how it relates to mental well-being. Do you hear any reverberations of that in broader culture, academic institutions? Do you see that still out there in the kind of radio waves, so to speak, right? It still does affect people. And part of the, I think, triggering nature of the topic can be, we're not sure if we're actually allowed to go down this taboo territory, right? And that's affected, I think, the first person experience of when people go and seek mental health services. Now, for people, I think largely in this room, you are the safe haven, right? For people who are looking for mental health care that is sensitive to their spiritual life. You're not going to view it as a sabotaging of their mental well-being, but rather see it as a resource. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this with you today is to acknowledge and actually maybe encourage you to recognize that your intuitions and your perspective have actually come out in the recent psychological literature and the scientific peer-reviewed studies. That actually what you're doing is more beneficial to people. And I'll show you that why in a minute. The roots of that, though, that real shift happened almost in parallel timing, but it just wasn't the mainstream. So Gordon Allport is the personality psychologist that we now, I think, owe a lot of credit to the prevailing theory of personality as the 5-factor model of personality. That our personality is broken up into agreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, and conscientiousness. This person that you see in front of you was the person who really opened up that whole scientific world. And what's less known, though, about Gordon Allport is that he was also a very committed psychologist of religion. He also developed the first scale that looked at what's called now intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity. So he developed the beginnings of the neo, but he also developed the intrinsic religiosity measure. What's really interesting about that is that when you look at those two different perspectives of how you incorporate religion into your life, one that's self-motivated, if it's coming internally from you, the other being externally motivated, to, for instance, come off looking good, for instance, in your religious pursuits to your social network. They have two very different relationships with health and well-being. So, for instance, intrinsic religiosity is negatively related to prejudice. Extrinsic religiosity is positively related to prejudice. Isn't that interesting? Gordon Allport, in the book, The Individual and His Religion, has this really poignant quote about the psychology of religion. And this comes after he was publishing that work. He says, religion, is the portion of personality that arises at the core of life and is directed toward the infinite. It is the region of mental life that has the longest range intentions. And for this reason is capable of conferring marked integration upon personality, engendering meaning, peace in the face of tragedy and confusion in life. We're going to talk about how we can actually now study how people understand infinite, that concept of infinitude. But what is really, I think, stood the test of time from his early work is that one thing people cannot argue with is that religion has this capacity to empower people, pull together multiple domains of their life into one unified picture of their trajectory through life. No one argues with that. From the left to the right, no one really argues with that basic finding. But it isn't just about temporal, it's about the infinite. It's about what goes beyond one single time frame. And this has really come out in coping literature. The longer term perspective you have, the better you're able to cope with the temporal disruptions that are happening around you, right? Carl Jung was also one of these early figures who really kind of broke camp from the mainstream. And Carl Jung, instead of seeing religious experience through the lens of suspicion, he saw it through the lens of functionalism. Religion has a function. And this is how he actually developed his personality theory, by studying sacred texts. And when he saw certain themes come across different sacred texts that had similarities or connections between them, he started calling those archetypes. And these became the archetypes of the unconscious, which was the ground bed of his personality theory. But embedded in that is this concept of the transpersonal, that over time and over places, there's a collective consciousness that people have. And so this quote from his lectures at Yale University really stand out to me, because he's really trying to tell us the great value that religion has for people's well-being. So he says, no matter what the world thinks of religious experience, the one who has it possesses the great treasure of a thing that has provided him with a source of life, meaning, and beauty. Again, those associated terms of the transcendence, the transcendentals. With a source of life, meaning, and beauty, and that has given a new splendor to the world and to mankind. And this is a phrase I love. Is there, as a matter of fact, any better truth about ultimate things than the one that helps you live? So, Bill, you were talking about the ultimate this morning, right? When you discover that ultimacy, not only does it give you a sense of coherence and direction in life, but it also helps you live life well, helps you to flourish. So while these conversations were going on, we heard a little bit this morning about the movements of Christian counseling, Christian integration, biblical nouthetic counseling, pastoral counseling, and then the mental health organizations that started to pop up all over the place, like the American Counseling Association, the National Association of Social Work, the APA, all started to develop kind of their unique take on how does this then get applied, right? And I mentioned I went to a Christian integrationist institution, but then I worked for a number of years as a faculty member at Loyola University in the pastoral counseling department. And so I shifted over into this other stream that was going on. And then I also had the experience of being in mainstream mental health organizations like ACA. And they also had their kind of unique set of questions, and some kind of pulled more from the taboo history side, some more from the religious experience side. But this is where our training programs have really kind of come from. Whether or not they're housed in seminaries or whether or not they're housed in universities, largely they're coming from these mostly Christian responses, not exclusively, there's others, but mostly Christian responses to those questions of what does it mean to have a religious experience, and is it beneficial for our well-being? In the 1990s, this conversation shifted a little bit, actually quite a bit, into what we now call multiculturalism. And so if you talk to anybody who went through a training program in the 80s, or was training people in the 80s or before, they will probably readily acknowledge multiculturalism was not something that was being talked about. Most of mental health training was happening from the perspective of white majority culture, and even deeper within that, middle class white majority culture. When the 1990s multicultural movement happened, there are a few things that influence spirituality. One is that in a sense it legitimized the spiritual quest. And what I mean by that is that the multicultural model opened up conversations that were just not being had in mainstream mental health programs. One was culture, one was race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. But later on the scene was religion. It wasn't at the forefront of the movement, but toward the end of the 1990s, because there was a recognition that people's identities matter, we need to also acknowledge that people have religious identities. This was a bit of a mismatch with academia, because in academia, the majority were non-religious, right? And so this was a bit of a kind of blind spot alongside of other issues of diversity that started to kind of bubble to the surface, but it wasn't on the leading edge. It kind of came as that momentum was building. The multicultural models have mostly put religion and spiritual experience at the more center part of the circles. At the individual level, that people have these individual experiences, or at the group level, that they are part of a religion. They're less, I would say, likely to include it at the universal level, that this is something that everybody finds relevant or experiences. This is, of course, a bit of tension here, I think, with the multicultural models and what the religious and spiritual traditions have been saying, that this is actually a universal phenomenon that people experience. Part of that, too, happened because, well, religions are just very prevalent in our society. United States has been, for many years, the most religious, industrialized economy in the world. And it remains that way to this day, actually. What is confusing people currently is, why are people leaving religions in the United States? So, majority of people, roughly 80% of the US population, still identifies with a religion. But as we heard this morning, not everybody believes the same thing about their religion. So you encounter a lot of different, even though people say they are Christian or Jewish or Hindu, you may encounter a lot of different perspectives inside those groups themselves. What's also confusing is that people aren't necessarily becoming atheist overnight. Okay, so when you look at the major shifts that have happened, Christianity's been losing members, other religions have been gaining members slightly. It's really the spiritual but not religious that have been growing exponentially. Atheist agnostic has remained about 4 to 5% over the last 20 years. That's not really where the growth is. So people remain very spiritually curious. They may even believe in God, but not identify with a religion. They may report experiences like we shared this morning, of sacred moments that they have. They may even find it psychologically beneficial. There's been a lot of literature coming out about that too, that people find it not only beneficial, but relevant to the care that they receive from a mental health professional, right? So what this has done is that it's made it not only something that we should be studying because there's so many people who are religious, but we also need to be studying this because it may potentially relate to health. When that question started to really emerge in the 90s, simultaneously with the multicultural movement, that's when the scientific studies really started to hit the mainstream. So if you look at that graph there, that's a breakdown of how many studies are published in that 3-year cycle. And so when you get to the 1990s, that's when you start to see the momentum pick up. And what you notice about that is that there is no plateau to that curve, right? Every year, there's more and more scientific studies that came out from the previous 3 years. It's actually at a rate, which I'll talk about in a minute, that's almost doubling every time this gets looked at. But what are they looking at? Well, one I mentioned earlier, they're looking at religious identity. How does identity relate to health? But they're also looking at religious involvement, how often you engage in religious practices. They're looking at different types of beliefs people carry with them. And they're also looking at the practices that they engage in. What are the things that they do in order to practice their religion, praying, meditating on sacred scriptures, etc. when that started to pick up pace, like I said, it's been exponentially every year. There's almost double the amount of studies. So that graph I showed you, roughly around 2010, there were 3,000 published studies, and that was only about 70%, they estimated, of the studies that were actually out there. They did that again 10 years later, and Harold Koenig, this is a great volume to have on your shelf to kind of say, hey, why is this helpful? This is the most robust compilation of all these studies into one place. It's the Handbook of Religion and Health from Oxford University. 2020, over 6,000 studies. And it's at the point now where Harold Koenig and his colleagues just readily admit there's too many studies for us to keep track of anymore. We haven't counted them all. And that's only looking at studies that have been screened. So they're not only looking at them for, did they happen, but they're looking at them for their rigor. How do they actually explain human health, right? And what have they so far mapped out? Well, as it turns out, religion connects to all aspects of health. Whether or not you look at mental health, social health, health behaviors, physical health, public health, the relationships are there. Sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative, but the relationships are there. And so what this has done is really substantiated what people have been saying for thousands of years, that spiritual practice, religious practice is good for flourishing. It helps people as they go through life and tackle life's challenges. So I know this is a mental health audience, so what does mental health look like when you peer into these studies that have come out? The best mapped out areas are these that you see in front of you. Coping, depression, bipolar, suicide, anxiety, schizophrenia, substance use, personality traits, psychological well-being, and positive emotions. Some of these are better researched than others. So for instance, coping, there's a very robust coping literature now. Less so when you look at schizophrenia. Less studies when it comes to personality disorders. There's a lot of studies related to anxiety, depression, and there's more studies related to psychological well-being and positive emotions. And for the most part, the majority of those studies do show positive relationships. That the more you practice religions, the more involved you are, the less likely you are to experience anxiety, right? But not in every case. There are still issues that come up in those contexts, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This graph, just to look at one area, coping, this graph shows you what was the most Google search, or actually the most searched term on the internet back in 2020 of March 2020. Anything going on you think that might have happened in March of 2020, right? The whole world came unglued, right? And so when you have a mass trauma like that, a mass traumatic event, it isn't like trying to navigate, trying to get up and go to work, right? It's the very fabric of the world seems like it's being shaken from the foundations, to borrow another phrase from Paul Tillich. The very foundations of the world are falling apart. And what happens when people experience those ultimate existential challenges? They pray. So the most Google searched word or internet search word at the time, when you see it go over to the right side, was prayer. Across the world, people were trying to find a way to cope through prayer, right? And that is probably one of the most well mapped out areas of the relationship between psychological well-being and spirituality, is that it does help people cope for sure, right? The other place that's probably the best researched is addictions and spirituality. So what is the most well-researched, evidence-based treatment, bar none? It's not CBT, right? Most of us tend to think CBT is kind of the gold standard for research, and there's a lot of reasons why for that. It's easy to research. But it's actually 12-step. 12-step is the most well-researched evidence-based treatment. Think about that for a minute. It's been going on again for 100 years, right? When the 12-step movement got it up and running in the 1900s, Carl Jung also played a significant role in that, actually. People started to meet in groups to talk through and self-disclose about the challenges they were having with alcohol. But also what happened is that people were having spiritual experiences. And so these are now called vital spiritual experiences in addiction recovery. So about 4 years ago, we published a study where we interviewed people who were going through the process of addiction recovery. And we asked them about, have you ever had a vital spiritual experience in the process of recovering? And tell us about that. What was that like? And what we found was that, yes, people do have these. They're well documented in the literature on addictions recovery. But they're so diverse in the way that they can manifest. They so clearly, to me, replicate those early phenomenologies we have of religious experience. People talked about how they started to have a spiritual experience in the midst of a recovery meeting and in the relationships that they had with their sponsors. When, and again, transient and passive. Some people weren't even looking for a spiritual experience, and it occurred. However the pathway was for people, what did come across as clearly common was that this helped them recover. When that happened, it served as an anchor for their recovery process. So it isn't simply meeting in a group. Meeting in groups is helpful. Universality is a great thing. But spiritual experience can happen when people meet, or it might not happen when people meet. It's actually a separate process, okay? So it's not just simply, in other words, social support. It isn't just people getting together and talking. There are unique experiences that people have that aid their recovery process, and they're called vital spiritual experiences. Right? The scientific literature has also been expanding in its awareness of how personality relates to these spiritual experiences. And so those 5 dimensions of personality, your openness to experience, conscientiousness, as it turns out, those are not related to spirituality. Spirituality has now been documented for over 20 years. The seminal study came out in 1999, that spiritual experience is a separate domain of personality. It's not explained by whether or not you have kind of an openness to different types of beliefs, for instance. But spiritual transcendence has its own unique pathway of explaining human behavior. And that's been replicated across the globe now in, I want to say, about 12 different languages. Right? So personality, it's a powerful way that we can explain why people do certain things, like why do you walk into a room and all of a sudden you want to start talking to people, or why you want to immediately exit the room, right? Extroversion, introversion. It's a powerful way to explain it, but spirituality, religiosity don't exist on those dimensions. They're their own dimension of human behavior and human experience. So talk therapy, it's evolved a lot over the last 100 years. It moved from kind of theoretical orthodoxy to evidence-based practices. And what happened, right? When people started looking at these different theories scientifically, they realized there's a bit of a dodo bird effect, right? So there's a lot of different ways you can practice counseling psychotherapy, and they all seem to work, is basically what they found, right? You practice CBT, you practice interpersonal, you practice psychodynamic. They work. but why do they work, right? And that launched the evidence-based practice movement. And the evidence-based practice movement is that we need to pay attention to scientific research. We need to be aware of clinical experience and the value that experience as a clinician has. But we also need to be paying attention to patient preferences. The majority of clients, now we have documented evidence nationally, would prefer to see someone like you all that will engage in their spiritual life openly, with curiosity, as a part of standard mental health care. Right? That study, though, didn't come out until about 4 years ago. So that's a relatively newer question that we've even been asking on a broad scale, right? So what helps? The common factors help. The typical client-centered variables, turns out Rogers was pretty much right, It really is the therapeutic alliance that takes up the lion's share of what helps in counseling and psychotherapy. But what is that therapeutic alliance? It's the positive bond you have with your client. It's the agreement on the goals, the tasks that you have with your client. And this phrase from Yalom I love, it's the relationship that heals. Whatever technique you want to use, if you don't have a relationship, they tend to fall flat. Now, it isn't that they don't matter at all. They do matter, but the foundation is not there. And so, the field has really recognized that whatever we're doing, we have to make sure we're paying attention to the therapeutic alliance, right, for that reason. Now, what's happened is that this has now made its way into looking at, okay, what if you explicitly include religion in, say, for instance, CBT? So at the Center for Spirituality, Theology, and Health at Duke University, again, Harold Koenig and a number of collaborators have taken Aaron Beck's CBT manuals and then infused them with different religious perspectives. So they've gone through and they've created a Christian version, a Jewish version, a Hindu version. And then they started to test these out and see, okay, how does that compare to like traditional CBT? As it turns out, there are now 97 randomized controlled trials that have looked at that question. So there's so many studies now that there are now what are called meta-analyses of those studies. And what these studies do is they look at all those findings and then they develop one effect size estimate for the effect of religious CBT on mental well-being. And as it turns out, across 7,000 patients that were studied in this meta-analysis, religious CBT, or others like it, when compared to traditional CBT, or others like it, produce equivalent mental health outcomes. So, same reductions in stress, same reductions in anxiety as their secular counterparts. Okay? But the benefit of explicit incorporation of, and these are called religiously accommodative therapies for that reason, for explicitly incorporating religious perspectives into a CBT manual is that they uniquely and superiorly affect spiritual outcomes as compared to their secular counterparts. So what's missing when people don't directly address religion or spirituality? They miss out on the potential gains and benefits that people can have as they experience their spiritual well-being. All right? That's now documented. I know you all know this from experience, right? But your experience lines up very well with now what is in the scientific literature. That study came out, again, about 4 years ago, 2019, right? This is one of my favorite books. I love Lisa Miller. And The Awakened Brain, if you haven't read it, you got to get a copy of it. Lisa Miller's been a trailblazer for the field. She was actually one of the first people to look at spiritual experiences through fMRI studies, and then to look at how that relates to depression, brain scans. So when people experience depression, it happens in what's called the default mode network of the brain. As it turns out, when people have spiritual experiences, that default network goes quiet. And so it's inversely related to depression. Her work, what she has found is that when people report a robust spiritual wellness, 80% less likely to develop substance use disorders. 80%. 60% less likely to develop major depression. That's even more after accounting for genetic heritability. So we know genes play a role in depression. Her landmark studies that came out in the 90s showed that when people, in genetic twin studies, when people have a spiritual family, a robust spiritual identity, that prevents the development of prevention over and above the effect of genetic history. 70% less likely to engage in high-risk behaviors like unprotected sex. So it prevents STDs, right? 50% to 80% less likely to attempt suicide. These are really powerful numbers, and I don't think we're talking about them enough. I mean, when you think of what can be prevented in a person's life when they pay attention to their spiritual development, it's profound. And that's coming out now in the scientific literature. So over the last year, I've been working with Lisa on implementing what are called awakened awareness groups across university campuses. As you probably have seen in the news, mental health on campuses is at an all-time low, right? And so what's interesting is that from her work, there are three major developmental windows that happen spiritually across the lifespan. One is in emerging adulthood, so the college age group. One is in middle age, and then the last is toward the end of life. What happens for people is that if they don't pay attention to and seek answers for compelling responses to questions that emerge during that time of life, they're far more likely to experience depression, major depression. And so what her work has been about is on college campuses, can we enliven the conversation and at least the engagement with the spiritual seeking process on college campuses in an inclusive way that captures a lot of different perspectives, and then see what effect that has on people's well-being. So the first pilot studies came out about a year ago, and they were able to demonstrate not only are college students seeking this type of experience, but are also benefiting from this experience. Less likely to experience depression, anxiety, but also traumatic symptoms, PTSD symptoms, as they go through these groups. More likely to engage in what they call awakened awareness, but also spirituality, spiritual transcendence, as well as resilience overall. They just reached out to me this week, actually, after this last year of doing this across multiple campuses across the country that replicate those findings. So I'm hoping to see those published results very soon. I don't have them for you right now. But I think that that's really the cutting edge, is seeing how at younger ages people engage in spiritual seeking. I talked about this at the beginning, sacred moments. So sacred moments are now being studied systematically. And as it turns out, not only are these normal, that these happen in the course of counseling, but people benefit from them. When people have a sacred moment with their counselor, it deepens the therapeutic bond, and it also enlivens their goal seeking. and symptom reduction along the way from these sacred moments that have these qualities that we've spoken about. Now, I mentioned that there are problems too. There are negative findings in this literature. And where you find these is in the context of struggles that people have. When people have spiritual religious struggles, they are a very unique pathway towards psychological distress. What I mean by that is that if they're not addressed explicitly, they can sabotage the therapeutic process. And when people don't address them, it isn't that they go away. Spiritual religious struggles, once they start happening, they tend to remain in place and get worse unless people address them directly. So this has really, I think, caught the attention of a lot of mental health professionals because routinely, spiritual religious struggles come up regardless of the therapeutic context. Whether or not you're in a church setting, whether or not you're in a community-based mental health setting, spiritual religious struggles are common. Actually, about half of the population over the last week reports experiencing one of these spiritual or religious struggles. That's how common and prevalent that they are. And so when you find negative relationships between religion and spirituality, usually there's a spiritual struggle that's embedded in that experience for people. So where does that leave us now? This is a summary. The APA published a few years ago a handbook of the psychology of religion and spirituality that put all of this into one place. But these are now, I think, fairly common consensus perspectives that the psychology of religion now has on spirituality. They're multidimensional. There's a lot of different parts to these. There's behaviors, there's emotions, there's practices. They occur at different levels, so at the individual, group, universal level. They're salient to different identities. They're factors of individual differences. They help explain outcomes over and above other things we know are happening, social support, personality. They're multivalent, which means that they have both negative and positive relationships to mental well-being. So it isn't just all positive. I don't want anybody walking away saying, spirituality just is good stuff. There are problems here that we have to pay attention to. And then the last is people want to talk about it. Clients want to talk to you about their spiritual lives. And when clients want to talk about something, that means it's important. And so it should be important to mental health professionals. Okay, so we'll go ahead and draw it to a close. I know I'm over on my time, so I appreciate the flexibility. And thank you for your attention. I'll see you this afternoon.